All right. So let's just kind of get started. What I I think the first good thing to bring up would be the expansion release date, just because that's
Okay.
been a very hot topic, and I know on Twitter that you gave your thoughts, so they were spoiled for me. But
Yep.
maybe you can tell me a bit why it is that you think it's the date that it is.
Sure. So the date I said on Twitter was I think December 12th slash 13th. Maybe it's 13, 14. I forget if it releases on like a Monday, Tuesday overlap day at midnight or whatever, or Tuesday, Wednesday. But anyway, one of those. Um, my reason for thinking that was I think it's very unlikely that it releases much earlier than that, like maybe December 6th, I could see. But to me, it seems like the expansion is being just barely fitting within 2022, I would say, in terms of when it'll be ready and release and whatnot. Because I'm not quite trusting the developers saying that it's ready and it's far along in development, things like that, just because we haven't seen very much of the talent trees. We haven't had alpha to play yet, or beta, obviously, playing with the new zones, quests, all that type of stuff. And then I don't think it can be that much later. Like, it probably can't be the 20th because then it's just immediately like the holidays. And I don't think they want to launch an expansion and be immediately going on vacation. And they also probably don't want to launch an expansion and immediately have people working on the holidays. Both of those kind of seem don't not ideal. So I think the 13th was a good middle ground where they can launch the expansion, make sure everything's like going okay smoothly ish for like a week, week and a half, and then
Your
go on like
mic,
holiday break
your
for
mic
like a
is
week.
so bad right there that I had to stop you for a second. Holy shit! But
Okay. Do I need to repeat something?
just the very last sentence.
Okay. Uh, I said the 13th they can work on the expansion, make sure it's running smoothly for like the first week, week and a half, and then go on holiday break, and then come back at like the start of January, the first week of January, and have the raid launch. Like maybe the raid launch is like January 3rd, and then go from there. And that's like the first tier of the expansion or whatever. So I think 13th is like 3 weeks before the raid launches, but there's the holiday break in between, kind of, and yeah. So that was the reason of my guess.
I think I agree with you in that regard. I just don't think that having any release date towards the end of the year is even that good of an idea, because even that, like, if you do have the raid release afterwards, what you're doing is you're basically having an expansion release with a, like, somewhat extended raid release, right? Like where you'd have more time
Delayed
before
or
it.
something. Yeah.
Yeah, to some degree, right? Because so Shadowlands released, let's see, the date was November 23rd, and then they
Mm-hmm.
ended up having the world first kill was what, on the 23rd of December, right? So exactly a month after. So we
Mm-hmm.
had heroic probably 2 weeks in, and then mythic 3 weeks in, which is what made it last the time that it did, right? So if you did it from your perspective, you'd basically have heroic releasing right around, it would, the time frame would have been so that heroic would release right around New Year's Day or Eve or so, right? Or the mythic raid in that same time frame. So it would have to be delayed. It's like this whole concept of them trying to push it by 2023 is daunting, right? Because any earlier release, we just have that fear of systems aren't finished. And I know that
Right.
I've seen your takes on Twitter, at least in that regard, that a lot of people are like, well, time wouldn't have solved it, but there were plenty of things that were wrong with it and have remained wrong with it, right? I know a couple of them are with Hunter specifically, right?
Yeah, I mean, specifically with Hunter, I mean, in the launch of the expansion, I noticed some bugs myself, and reported them and made YouTube videos. But also, some things have just been bugged the whole expansion, and never got fixed. But also, some stuff like it launched broken, but then got fixed later, right? So clearly, time helps to some extent. I think it kind of depends as far as like bugs and changes in philosophy and stuff like that. Some of it, the changes in philosophy aren't probably going to change during beta. I mean, if it's a significant thing like conduit energy, um, or the AoE cap on certain abilities that was a hard cap at launch and things like that. I think some of that stuff, it's kind of like whether we had 3 months more of beta and alpha for Shadowlands, I don't think they were probably still going to change that stuff before the launch of the game. But some other stuff that's clearly just bugged and not working properly or something, that stuff can probably get fixed the more time you have. And the bigger thing that I'm worried about is not that they can't or won't fix those things in the future because generally they do a pretty good job. It's more so that they won't have time to fix it before launch, and even if they get fixed later, it still just kind of makes the launch experience worse. And I think just for the devs themselves, like being in rush crunch time or whatever, and all the high stress and things like that, I think it just generally makes for a worse product in the end and a launch in general. And I don't think it's good for them to be playing catch up all the time. Like I kind of want them to be able to launch in something that they're confident with and then make improvements from there rather than always trying to be putting out fires basically.
Yeah, the launch is such a strong determinant for how many players stick around, right? Because like you have your biggest influx of players then, and if you show them a bad game at that point, you're gonna lose your subscribers and whatnot, right? I
Mm-hmm.
think some of that will definitely be delayed. Like there were probably things upon the Shadowlands release that people weren't a big fan of, like the whole Maw experience, right? Where
Yeah.
players were willing to get geared to some extent, maybe over the course of that first 2 or 3 month period, but then they kind of realized themselves are like, I did that, and I don't really want to do that again next patch, even if next patch like seems like it could be better, and it's so
Mm-hmm.
far away that like that itself would just push players away. Um, and then there's like the whole concept of how long the raid should last and the raid nerfs too, right? So we saw some significant nerfs this time around. This tier was a bit of an outlier for sure. Like I don't think that we can really draw too many data points from it, but I feel like the fear is that Blizzard certainly will, right? We've seen consistent massive changes based on feedback from raids and such. I think like over the course of Shadowlands, we saw some really good mid tier bosses, and I wonder if we'll ever see those style of bosses shifted to like ladder bosses in the tier. So instead of having Painsmith where it was or something like that, making that equivalent placement of KT. I think I would personally really enjoy that, where it does feel like it's ramping up and isn't kind of like a hill in terms of difficulty.
I think for most of the player base, it's probably better to have a smoother curve like that. I do like I didn't hate it when you had Painsmith and then you killed Guardian pretty easily, and then Fate Scribe wasn't too bad and you were kind of then on KT. I kind of like the kill the hard mid wall boss and then get a little bit of a breather before gearing back up to fight the hard end boss. I kind of like having a little bit of a break like that compared to just going hard second last boss into hard end boss, and it's just like a bunch of weeks of extending in a row and uh, bunch of wiping in progress like the whole time because you only really get like I would say a couple days of like, oh man, we're gonna almost kill the boss tonight maybe, and it's like exciting and you're very excited to raid. And some of the other nights it's like I'm spending 2 or 3 weeks wiping in P1, and it's just like a slog that you kind of get through to get to the end, uh, where the boss becomes actually fun and you're kind of playing the whole fight out. And so I think having sometimes too many of those fights back to back really just drains people like energy wise and stuff like that kind of. So I think a little bit of a break can be good, but maybe instead of being like the fifth or sixth boss, it's better to have that as like the eighth boss, and then like nine is kind of easy and then go to 10 is hard, rather than like having it be so early in the raid, especially when you were losing great vault slots and things like that for extending that early.
Yeah, and I think that largely differs though based on the guild, right? Like if you are a guild that hasn't seen CE or you're trying to kind of move up in those ranks, having a big wall boss like that really negatively affects the guild. You'll have players leave because when you hit that kind of boss, it's when people um, have their true abilities kind of show, like what people are capable of, right? And that's a big determinant for recruitment, just from my own experience, right? Like when I saw Painsmith, there were a lot of changes in my own group at the time, based off of that solely. Even when we hit it in heroic, it was an interesting early determinant for all of that.
Yep.
Um, and then
Yeah, I definitely think it's also kind of a perception issue as well. Like, I think a lot of times when guilds reach those mid wall bosses, that's when they kind of are like, they either expect nerfs to come very soon, uh, and especially if a lot of guilds are reaching it at the same time where even the higher CE guilds are. like maybe they won't nerf the boss for a couple weeks because they want the CE guilds to like actually progress past it and stuff, and then it just creates a big bottleneck, or like they get there and they almost think like it's kind of the separator and they can't go past it compared to CE guilds and things like that, and so people will either look when they're recruiting or changing guilds or something just to join a guild that's already past that point and not
That's true.
join the guilds that are on that boss and things like that. So it does create a lot of weird cultural issues, I think, generally. So I think having it be a smoother curve is generally better overall for sure.
Yeah, and with us, so we raided together in toward the very, very end of Nathria
Yep.
through till now, right? So I didn't get
Yep.
to experience half credit, the group that we were with together, their kind of council experience, right? I had an my own experience was I was with a guild that died on council because their leadership felt like the players that they had weren't capable of killing it.
Mm-hmm.
And then I I had the option, right? I could go look for a guild that was on Sludgefist or something like that. But it was just one of those things like I felt like I needed to kill council. It was so important to me. So I joined a group that had a similar progression to the guild that I was in that was dying. And I think it was that same week that I joined it that they killed it. Didn't end up staying with them because the environment was terribly toxic and some very just a very racist environment overall. And I was like, yeah, after that 1 week there's no way I'm staying in it there. But I'm interested in what you think then more about the different wall bosses that we've seen, because I mean council and sludge were probably wall bosses. I don't know if it was sludge was a wall for you when you saw it or not.
Uh, yeah, I don't remember when you joined Have Credit exactly, but
It
Sludge
was
was
on
definitely a wall for
sire.
them.
It
Okay.
was literally on the last boss, yeah.
Yeah, and so my expansion experience was a little weird. So my rating history was like I didn't rate at all until Legion, and then the start of Legion, well, actually, kind of the end of Warlords of Draenor. I watched like a ton of Preaches content and stuff like that, and I kind of came into I had also break from the game for a long while, and so I was coming back to the game at that point. Last time I had really played kind of seriously was in Cataclysm, and I had played a tiny bit in Mists of Pandaria at the end, but I didn't play Warlords of Draenor at all. But I came back and I was like, I want to raid. This is something that I hadn't done in the game previously. I had basically just done pug raids and stuff like that in like Wrath of the Lich King, in ICC and stuff. And I wanted to like actually raid in a guild. I had never really like been in a guild in an organized sort of setting before. And so I came into Legion with the intention of like trying to mythic raid, um, basically. And so uh to cut a longer story short, in that first tier I went from having never raided before in any organized environment to clearing all of heroic within I think the first 2 or 3 weeks and got AOTC, and then joined a probably medium to low end CE guild. Uh, well, it was a guild, but it was the second team of that guild.
Okay.
Um, and I progressed, I think, 5 bosses in Emerald Nightmare with them, maybe 4, I don't remember. And then I joined the main team from there, which was like a US top 50, top 100 CE guild at that point. And then I raided with them in Trial of Valor, all of progression, and um, Nighthold Mythic, and then I actually got like so burnt out in Legion that I quit
Mm.
midway through Nighthold progression. And I didn't really enjoy the environment that I was raiding with then, and so I just stopped playing the game entirely after that point. But then when I came back for Shadowlands, so I didn't play at all during BFA either, or the rest of Legion. Um, and I started out, I was in a similar starting spot where I didn't have a guild to join, so I was just starting from nothing. So I joined an AOTC guild for the first few weeks, and then I joined Have Credit after that when they were, I think, like 3 bosses into Mythic or so. So I didn't get the start of Mythic experience with Have Credit,
Okay.
but then I got the rest from there, like Zymox, Sun King, um,
The reasonable bosses, yeah.
Dark Vein Council, Sledgefist, yeah, all the way through CE with them. Um, Council was definitely a wall. It wasn't like super bad though. If I remember right, it took maybe around 80 to 100 pulls. Um, and I don't think it would have been as bad of a wall boss with different better players also. Like I think for a better guild, it probably could have been under 80 for sure, like maybe closer to like 50 or 60
Yeah.
pulls at that time. So part of that was just the guild, not being as good as I was used to. But it wasn't like the guild got demoralized or like felt super walled by it and needed nerfs. If I remember right, we were close to a kill on it, and then the nerfs did come in for the tank ad that you kited in the P3.
Yeah.
Um,
Yeah.
like the week that we killed it, from my memory. Sludgefist was definitely more of a wall. That one took like 120 pulls or something. Um, to my memory, and that was definitely a fight where I think one of the first times that we got to the end of the fight with everybody pretty much alive, we killed it, which feels about right for what that fight is in terms of kind of being a patchwork boss thing like that. But I think the hardest part was it was just doing a lot of damage and
Yeah.
a lot of requiring a lot of throughput from people. And the DPS check was definitely tight. I think we killed that fight with like three people alive or something when we killed it because we had basically hit the hardened rage and people started dying at the very end in like the last percent. Um, so
Yeah.
yeah, it was a medium wall boss. I would say it was easier than Painsmith, but just because I think Painsmith was definitely a harder boss, but it required less. It was more of a throughput check. Painsmith was more of a mechanics check. Um, I don't know what a good comparison would be to Sledgefist at the time. And
Yeah.
then still
It's
the
tough
Legion
to.
Generals was weird because it was just a lot of like it felt similar to Kel'Thuzad, where it was a lot of like playing the mechanics of the fight more so than throughput. But the throughput did matter because there were DPS checks on certain things, like killing the upstairs ads or stuff like that. So Sludgefist was just a weird fight, and there was still changes happening to it. I think while we were progressing it at the time. So
Yeah. And um, SLG just had a massive pull count relative
mm-hmm.
to in those other bosses. Like I can look back through it on my other screen, but I think SLG, yeah, it shows that it was basically a 150 to 240 pull boss, depending on the guild, right?
Yeah,
I
and
think
I think for half credit it was probably closer to 300 almost by the end. I think it was like 270, 280 or something.
yeah, KT was a 40 to 80 pull boss,
Right.
right? So like the difficulty may have been similar, but in terms
In
of
terms
like
of how the
what made it
mechanics worked.
difficult, yeah,
Yeah.
yeah, exactly. And I mean, I think looking back at it, it's you're obviously going to have your favorite bosses and your least favorite bosses. I think to go from Sanctum of Domination, where there were a lot of very low full count bosses, into the into Sepulcher, where we're at now, where everything feels like, or like a lot of the ladder bosses feel like they have really high pull counts. Jailer's 250 to 370 right now.
Hmm.
Rygalon's 100 to 150. Lords of Dread's an outlier being so low. Anduin itself being 180 to 270. That's really massive, right? To have something like Anduin, and I know that they've nerfed that extensively, and that this whole tier is an outlier, but it's honestly shown. I think we've seen tons and tons of guilds die, or just say that they're not raiding until Dragonflight at this point.
Hmm.
And
I'm gonna pull a max on you and say I don't think pull counts are necessarily the best indicator because I think a lot of the fights this tier have had very early fast wipes in P1 a lot of the time. Like Jailer has it if like bombs or people get MC'd and stuff like that. Anduin has it if people explode with the blasphemies or just like the groups going downstairs like you can't live through the intermission. Halandras has it a ton with the bombs. Rygalon probably has it with uh, some of the orbs exploding or not getting soaked in time or like um, not killing the quasars in time and stuff like that. So I think a lot of the fights in this tier also had maybe inflated pull counts a little bit by that, just because they were you wiped so often because they were so fast and so early in the fight compared to a lot of other fights. Um, yeah, but
yeah,
obviously this tier still was like probably one of the hardest of all time, uh, and definitely an outlier in terms like even if that's true, I think it doesn't change the fact that this tier was a little bit beyond what it should have been probably. But
yeah, and even if you look beyond the pull counts, if you just look at the amount of time spent progressing the boss itself, instead of like
mhm.
looking at it for pull counts, because that'll at least help even it out. It does still feel and does seem to me like Sepulchre just had a larger progression time per boss.
Definitely.
I mean, obviously there are outliers, so it's hard to like smooth it out. But if you like take the top three, those definitely felt like long slogs. I know that that's kind of where the jailer feels right now. Because as we're making this, we're currently, you could argue we're P2 progressing. We've got,
I think borderline P3,
yeah,
end of P2
borderline.
into P3. Yeah.
Yeah. I don't view it as progress until like we can feel comfortably on any pole to make it through, and it does still feel like P2 is a bit iffy.
Hmm.
Um, but there's just so many individual actions that can cause a wipe on this type of fight that it just feels horrendous to progress. Right, that you'll have people that have kind of progressed past a mechanic, um, and others that haven't, and it's kind of waiting for them to catch up at that point. Right, I know that's the way it is for a lot of bosses, but
Well, and the thing I don't like is like even if a couple people are dead or whatever, it's you can't really progress the fight with only like 16 people because you just fall behind in everything. Like especially with the
yeah.
blood soaks on Azeroth. And like if anyone in those groups die, which they're probably the most likely people to die at the same time, um, you kind of just you can't really progress the fight
Sure,
much further without
P2
that.
or P1, or both, honestly.
I mean, kind of both, yeah, in combination, but mainly P2 into P3, yeah.
Yeah, it does feel rough when you have like a large portion of your already ranged sitting out there and you don't have too many more. Like you can send a melee out there to at least continue it, but even when you're just down the people, you can't even kill the MCs in
Right,
P2.
yeah.
So that makes it just that much worse. Um and speaking of like seeing this boss right now, we're gonna probably see it again next season, plenty of times with affixes already. This whole concept of a season 4 coming out, even if it's for a short-lived time, we're gonna see Jailer. Almost, it feels like we'll see Jailer more in season 4 than we are right now. You know, uh,
Kinda. I mean, definitely like killing it more often, probably more times in season 4. Depends on how long it lasts, maybe, but yeah,
it depends on
definitely
how
a
long it
possibility.
lasts, how well they tune it, because like the discussions that I've heard is that because people have kind of progressed these mechanics, that it's gonna kind of flow for them a lot as they pull these bosses. Like the world first race could be as short as a day. It could be tough as well. It could still last a week if they tune things a lot better. I know that they've made mistakes over the course of this whole expansion and the tiers with how borrowed power is obtained and whatnot, right? Like our experience with Sepulchre was fairly tainted because when we were seeing it, we were progressing Skolex as Double Legendary came out, and that boss just fell over the second we got that, right?
Yeah, that it definitely felt weird the timing of when you got I think double legendary especially. Four sets felt pretty okay. Maybe the creation catalyst could have come 1 or 2 weeks earlier, but I think the tier set acquisition felt mostly okay. Um, it did feel weird that you kind of felt like you couldn't progress very far into Mythic until your whole guild had Forset because they tuned it all around everybody having Forset because the split raids that the world first guilds were doing, they had it on every person in the raid like the second week pretty much except for maybe 1 or 2 people. So that felt a little bad that it felt like you were kind of like you can only kill maybe 3 bosses in Mythic until you complete the 4 sets. So I think that could have been either tuned differently for regular CE guilds, or the tier sets should have just been faster to acquire for guilds that were actually stepping foot into Mythic. Like if some of the early Mythic bosses dropped like heroic tier tokens or something, I don't know. That would be maybe weird, but
Yeah, it definitely felt bad each week to have time dedicated to working on Heroic again just for the tier sets. Like
yep.
just saying we're gonna take our actual progression time that we would normally spend and just work on that. So that on top of the bosses being tougher, like it's just really dragging this whole tier on for guilds of our caliber that we're raiding with right now.
I know
Uh,
I had mentioned this to you before also when we started Jailer Progress, but in previous tiers also, like you've killed the heroic boss, I would say at least a handful of times, 5 times or something on heroic, before you are done with clearing heroic for the tier. Maybe it's even more than that. Maybe it's up to like 10. Um, Whereas the jailer, because his loot was kind of not worth doing on heroic, and the tier sets were so important, and especially getting the mythic tier sets and great vault slots and things like that were so important, is that like I think I killed Jailer twice on my main character before we got to Mythic Jailer. And so it's the first time that I encountered a Mythic boss where I felt like I didn't already understand the fight really well going into it, and I was just learning the Mythic changes. It was like I was learning the whole boss entirely, like from start to finish, almost all over again, because it had been 2 or 3 months at that point since we had stepped foot into Heroic and been at the Jailer at all. So that also I feel like contributes probably to him not only having a high pull count and being a long boss in progression time, but also probably people just feeling like he's, I don't know. I feel like it's an artificial difficulty layer on top is that you're not as familiar with the heroic version.
Yeah, my own personal research for Jailer is it's the most I've researched any of the bosses, just because not only is it the end tier boss, but like all that you just said, like didn't have as much experience pulling that boss just over the course of the tier. I had tried doing like a little bit of raiding with a different character and some other groups that were progressing either heroic Jailer or now I'm in two groups that are on Mythic Jailer, and that brings its own troubles in and of itself. But like it it's a tough boss already, and a boss that just people haven't really pulled. It's just such an interesting concept to see. I wonder if when they look at tier sets for Dragonflight, if that's something that they'll consider factoring in, how they're gonna weigh that last boss, or if they're gonna try something that's over 10 bosses ever again.
I think 10 is a pretty good number. I feel like 8 or less kind of feels like too short of a raid sometimes, in my opinion. But anything more than 10, it starts to feel like there's maybe too many at the same time. So I think anywhere like 8, 9, 10 is sort of a good range. I know they've done as much as I think 13 or 14 bosses in the past. Um, and I do like having a mini raid every once in a while too that's like 2 or 3 bosses if they want to do that as well between tiers. But I think the way Shadowlands has gone, it seems like that's not going to be a likely thing to happen very often uh, over the course of an expansion, and definitely not like a regular expected thing anymore. So yeah, I don't know if that's ever going to be a thing, or if they'll just instead of having like an 8 boss raid and a 3 boss mini raid, they'll just combine it all and have 10 or 11 bosses in the same thing.
Yeah, I haven't had the pleasure of pulling one of those shorter raids or anything like that, but I will say that the whole Great Vault system having, 2, 5, and 8 required kills to get a raid slot is probably also going to affect their thought process going forward as well, unless they change how the Great Vault works going into Dragonflight. Like they can call it something else, but if you increase the amount that's required for that very first slot from 2 to 3 or whatever, I feel like they're going to get a lot of backlash because I definitely feel like the benefit of only having to do 2 raid bosses to actually see loot is great. Granted, the whole concept of extending lockouts kind of ruins that entirely, but but the reduction across raids, across dungeons, and across the honor required in PvP has been very noticeable, at least for me, when I'm maintaining multiple characters. Because we used to have it be you need to kill 10 bosses in raid, or even 9, I think, at a certain
Yeah,
point.
I think it was 3,
Not
7, 10.
3710 was the most it was, and then they kind of lowered it a little bit. I think they might have made it 369 before they reduced it to 258.
Yeah, I can't
Um,
remember, but
the dungeons used, I think it was 1, 5, and 10. I know 10 was the long end just because I was always doing 10. So
yep.
having to only do 8 was super nice. It felt a lot more reasonable when there were only 8 dungeons to like you could do one of each. And then now we're at this point where even the honor for the upper end, I think it used to be 6250 and they've reduced that down to the 5000s for the amount of honor actually needed for that final option. So they understand that they want to enjoy their other characters, and that's part of the nerf is that you can, if you have less to do on your mains, then you'll have more time to spend on your alts, and the people that are playing now are the ones that still want to do alts, because like I know you're not on as much as you used to be, and that's pretty
Hmm.
typical at the end of a tier. Like when I'm playing all the time, I like to play my alts. I'm at the point where I can't maintain all of them. I kind of just do one dungeon a week, I let that fill out my vault and just kind of hope that that one piece is good. But that's the extent that I intend to play them.
It's also a similar situation for me where, like, once we kill Jailer and have CE, I'll probably start playing the game more again and probably play alts more at that point. I generally sort of get into a mode where I play alts a little bit at the start just to have them maybe prepared and available to do, uh, an extra heroic run or something if people need. And then once progress gets started, that kind of takes my main energy and focus as far as like, um, researching fights and planning out cooldowns and figuring out, what optimal talents and conduits I should be taking and all that type of stuff. And then once that's over with and I kind of feel like I understand everything again, that's when I can start, I feel like, learning again on alts kind of. So that's sort of the way I do that. Um, I definitely agree that the reduction this season has been noticeable and very welcome, and I hope it sticks around. Um, Bringing it back for how they would do it if it's a mini raid, I think they would have it where, for example, if they had a 2 or 3 boss mini raid after Sepulcher, they would still have it where you had like the 2, 5, 8 or something for raid bosses, but you would just be able to get the raid uh bosses from Sepulcher still, in addition to the new raid. So you would maybe get your 3 from the new raid if you cleared that, and then you would go back and you could just do a quick farm clear of Sepulcher mythic bosses. Um,
Yeah, it's an interesting
to
thought.
fill up the slots at that point if you wanted to. If you don't, you can skip them. But I think that's similar to how they did it in um, Legion, at least with the Trial of Valor raid. I didn't play BFA, so I don't know exactly how it worked there. But
Yeah, I only caught the very, very tail end. That was my foray into heroic, so I didn't get to experience that to the full extent. Maybe when BFA Classic comes out, I'll take a good look at it. But how about season 4 and your involvement? So do you think that you're going to actually play season 4, given that they're going to have like a whole new slew of, or 6 dungeons that you haven't experienced in Mythic Plus before? I know that our focus is obviously on raiding. That's what we love doing, but dungeons clearly play a massive role in our own gearing process, right? And the fact that it's such a short season, like, I wonder how many people are just not going to play, knowing that if they invest the time into learning the dungeon, that it's just going to turn around and not even be available soon after.
yeah, I don't think the dungeons are as important in season 4 because of the changes that they're making to the raid loot systems and stuff, which I'm definitely uh very pleased to see, and I am all in favor for, and I wish they stick around after season 4 for the future because I love everything about them pretty much. Um, and I do think it's good that people who just want to focus on raid can probably do that and not feel as pressured into playing Mythic Plus if they don't want to. Um, I'm definitely intending to play season 4, most likely still on my main hunter. Um, but I've been tossing around the idea that I would maybe play it on an alt just to um, experience the fights differently at Mythic on a character that I enjoy playing, but that I never really got to take into Mythic very much. I did a little bit on my Havoc DH, and I have a tiny bit on my Mage, but that's about it. And even then, it's only kind of been on the early bosses for the most part on the Mage. So um, I don't know. I might do both. It depends on how the affixes feel, if they're fun. Depends on how the tuning is, because I hope that they're tuned to be fairly easy. I would expect the world first raids to clear them within, I would say, 2 days maximum, but probably more realistically even the first day, I think. Um, and yeah, I don't think it's a good thing if guilds are having to re-prog on the bosses. I think it's better if they're tuned to be at least fairly doable for CE guilds, I would say.
Yeah,
Like maybe
because
requiring like most of the week time, your raid time to clear, but like you can still clear the raid within the week kind of thing on like a 9 hour schedule type thing.
yeah, that seems entirely reasonable, and it would also feel really, really bad if the guild itself that you're clearing with got let's use Sanctum as an example, just because it's a bit easier, but got Sanctum CE, managed to kill Sylve comfortably and re-clearing, kind of the way that we were. But when
Mm-hmm.
we go revisit it, even though we have the exact, let's just say we have the exact same roster that we brought through and through,
Yep.
that we would not be able to kill it in this faded mode as in a season that could be as short as like 2.5 to 3.5 months, right? That's gonna feel absolutely awful. But they have also shifted their rewards, right? They put the mount gated behind normal. They put the title behind heroic, I think it was, and then portals behind mythic. I want to say is what I recall as to the reward system that they have.
I don't remember that. I do remember seeing portals, but I didn't realize that they changed them out in the title thing. I didn't see that.
Yeah, supposedly the new mount you'd be able to get if you have cleared, and I don't know if it's all of them or if it's just one of them. I would assume it'd be all of them, all of the normal bosses, which that's extremely attainable, and it's super great for the more casual community. For our group, getting portals doesn't matter too much. Who's gonna go back there after this is done, right? Like, oh, maybe we can get that so that we can farm the raids in the future for transmog or something.
Yeah,
But like I
depends if they're
won't.
also account-wide portals or if they're locked to your one character.
That's true too. Yeah, I don't feel like one of the driving factors I would say is for me at least now that I'm newer to it is I very highly value the mount and the title, not like for showing off reasons, but more as just like a collection of my own experience. Like I'd like to be able to
Hmm.
look back at the tiers that I did X, Y, and Z and look at it that way. I mean, I could do the same with the achievements, but just in a different manner, right?
Yep.
But the yeah, it doesn't feel like too much is gated behind this, but it also doesn't feel like anything's all that new. So it does feel like kind of a happy medium, I guess is how I
Yeah,
would put
I
it.
I do also think that if people don't want to play season 4 and they just want to take a break from the game, like I think the intention is that that's okay, and Blizzard is kind of expecting that some people will choose that option. Um, but I also think for the people that want to continue playing, that they have a bit more of a freshened up experience instead of just re-clearing the same raid for another 6 months, because that's what it would have been previously, and that definitely gets old at a certain point. Um, People do start gearing up alts and stuff like that so they can clear it on uh, different characters over the course if it lasts that long, which it usually does at the end of an expansion. But so I think this is a good change in that direction. I do wonder if people will, if they would have taken a break, if they feel pressured to stay for season 4, or maybe the opposite, where like if people would have stuck around longer if they're kind of intentionally, because they know nothing else is coming, and it's even the gear that you're getting in season 3 doesn't even matter that much compared to going into season 4, that um that they might also quit early after getting jailer CE. I know at least one of the people in our raid group is already planning on doing that and let you guys know that they're they're just killing jailer and that's it. So I also kind of
Yeah.
wonder if it's an early out the door option for people.
Yeah, and I mean, I know that it doesn't affect Blizzard and like their guild splitting up because what's going to happen is if a guild ever breaks apart, which it definitely like there will be guilds that die
Mm-hmm.
because of this. You'll have 10 people that want to raid till Dragonflight and 10 people that want to keep raiding. And if you want to keep raiding, there's only 10 people around. You want to do Mythic, like you're not going to try to recruit that many players. Like it's just not reasonable. I wonder how many guilds are going to try to take that break because I sit in the recruitment Discord. I see that there are players from Club Camel looking for, interim homes until Dragonflight comes out. Like they make it full up front. They're like, I'm gonna keep raiding with this guild, but or that's gonna continue at least in Dragonflight. Until then, I'm happy to help out another guild or something like that. And they're willing to seek something that's just a little bit lower just to keep playing. Um, and yeah, it doesn't affect Blizzard, but I think for guild leaders across all of Azeroth, it's freaking terrifying. The concept that their guild might just implode the day Jailer dies, right?
I think that's always a fear. I mean, kind of every tier, but especially the last tier of an expansion. I think guilds stopping raiding or dissolving and getting merged together or disbanding apart or whatever. I think that's a pretty normal thing that's expected, and it just kind of always happens naturally. But I do think that this might, like I said, it might kind of accelerate that or spark some of it sooner. I don't know, on a larger scale possibly. So yeah, I do wonder if from that extent, if Blizzard will see it as a successful experiment or not. Uh, and I wonder how much of the experiment is because it's hard because they're changing so much all at once that you can't really isolate that like that was the one variable that made people stop playing. Like it could have been that the dungeons got all removed and that they enjoyed still raiding, but because they don't have the dungeons that they've been playing the whole expansion, now they don't feel motivated to do M plus, and so they quit. But it's like, or was it that the loot is now too easy and they feel like they geared their character too quickly? And they don't have a reason to play the game anymore. Like it's hard to isolate what the specific reason is for each person when it's you're changing so many different aspects of the game at once. I feel like for season 4.
Yeah, that take about the dungeons is definitely from somebody that doesn't currently do dungeons. Like there are so
That's
many
also true,
people that are just so sick of the current state of the dungeons, and
right?
it
I mean, you're always gonna have people on both sides of a
absolutely,
change
yeah.
like that, though. Yeah.
That's
I was
hilarious.
trying to give reasons for maybe people not enjoying season 4. Yeah, I think
Are,
if you're sick of the dungeons, season 4 is probably a very welcome change.
are we going to see season 4 Keystone Hero Kai if it provides conduits or if not?
I hope it doesn't provide conduits because I didn't really enjoy doing it this tier, even though it was pretty easy because of tier sets spiking your power levels so hard, especially with double legendaries too. Um, I don't hate doing Mythic Plus, but I kind of tolerate it. Is the way I would describe it. I do it for the sake of making my character significantly stronger to some extent, especially early on in the season. But I quickly kind of lose my motivation to do it when I know that I'm essentially getting the same gear or better just doing raids, and it doesn't require me to do like whatever 8-10 dungeons on extra time during the week when raids are kind of my set aside WoW time, and having the other days be free where I can do other stuff is part of the appeal to me. And so if I'm still sort of motivated or incentivized to or pressured kind of to play WoW to do M plus during those days, it just kind of is like not my favorite thing. But
Okay.
I recognize that it's probably an inescapable part of signing up to raid at this point, so I tolerate it a little bit.
Yeah, if you're rating at this level, not that it's incredibly high, not that it's incredibly low, it's just kind of expected that you'll maintain that, right?
Yeah, it's part of just not holding the other 19 people that you're raiding with like back to some extent because you're not putting in the same effort that they are kind of and stuff like that. Like I definitely hate feeling like the person ever holding the group back. So I'm definitely motivated to do whatever it takes to not be that person. So that's part of that is on me, part of that is the game pressuring it at the same time, but it's not entirely the game's fault. So
And to kind of turn it back to the raids a bit, because, with the title being Extended Lockout Podcast, the concept of us having to consistently extend, ruining our chances of practicing on a boss or just even playing with a different group, just losing out on all these raid boxes that we're not able to obtain for 2, maybe 3 months at a time, right? Do you think that if they made this change, the proposed change is that if you have somebody in your group or something like that that has killed the bosses or whatever, let's just say we have somebody that has killed all the way up to Anduin, right? That you could then go into the raid, kill Vigilant Guardian, kill Skolex, and then go right to Anduin if you wanted to. Maybe they could treat it like a token system the way they do with the raid skips right now, right? You've got 4 times you have to kill Anduin before you can just go in, kill Vigilant, kill Anduin, and keep going, right? That's a good system, but it's a little bit outdated in terms of what the community wants. I almost feel like if you did have that system of, you had your Skolex coin that once you collected it 4 times, you're able to comfortably skip it. I feel like that would change the environment of the raid and might keep people interested a bit longer into the tier as well. I'm interested to hear your thoughts on that.
yeah, I mean, I definitely think that the way the current lockout system works isn't great and could definitely use some changes. I'm not sure I would be settled on any one idea as being the way that it should be done because I think they all kind of have pros and cons. Because I think I want to be able to actually still fight the boss and get the practice for it, and I don't just want to like get the loot for free or skip the boss entirely. But I also it's like but no matter how you do it, that does take time, and there's kind of no way of avoiding that. And if you're so limited on time, then you're always kind of incentivized to put that time, at least in your main raid group, towards the boss that you're progressing on, rather than a boss that you've already killed and can't really get much upgrades from, except for maybe certain people are wanting a certain item or whatever from the boss. But it's like it's hard to convince the 17, 18 other people to do that. Um, and so I
Well,
think
hold
having the
on.
bosses be puggable is a decent option, maybe, but then that kind of undermines a lot of like the lower, maybe non-CE guilds progressing in Mythic. And I don't know, it's a hard. I do think one thing for sure: less trash. That would speed everything up and give people more time to farm. It would mean farm takes less time and more time to progress or whatever, and just make the raid a more enjoyable experience for everybody. Too much trash in this raid.
I definitely agree about the trash. That concept of somebody holding the rest of the group hostage, we already saw that this tier. Granted, it was with heroic bosses, but like we had to hold raiders hostage to go help make sure everybody got their four set, right? Like I was one of the
That's
last
true.
people that got it, and we were in a position where we kind of said, we could go pull Mythic right now, or we could make sure that we get these players their loot. And another take that I've heard recently, because I spent a lot of time really late last night with one of our raiders looking into logs on things that he can
I
improve
saw
on.
you in there with Beto at 2 in the morning.
We were looking at things to improve on, but one of the biggest things that he came to me with was like he was kind of frustrated with a state where he wants to practice jailer. He wants to give more time to it than other people are,
Mhm.
but play on jailer. What he was hoping for was that he would be able to help another group, or not necessarily help, but just kind of experience the raid with another group
Mhm.
on Mythic that would need him in there, right? There's like definitely a guild out there that's got 19 people this week on the weekend. If
Yep.
somebody called out, whatever it is, he could fit their Shadow Priest slot perfectly and just experience the raid another time, practice more for main raid. And like I'm already employing this myself. Raiding in two groups right now has helped me significantly in some ways, and it's pretty detrimental in others. Like having two big different sets of weak auras that I have to work off of. I managed
Mhm.
through that. But I will definitely say, my experience seeing the bombs twice as many times as somebody else has is definitely going to help me make sure that I'm doing the best that I can in my main raid. Right?
Right. I think the best way to do it, especially if they're keeping personal loot and stuff like that, is like just have it so if you're locked to, for example, the break lockout, is that I could go do, Guild B, there I could join them on Jailer, but if they kill the boss with me in the raid, it's just like only the other whatever 19 people are eligible for loot from that Jailer. And like Beto for him to get loot, he can only get it from the break lockout. Like you assign yourself to a loot lockout, not like I can even join the raid at all and experience the boss lockout. I think that's probably a big difference that could work pretty well.
Yeah, that definitely does make a lot of sense. I think assigning yourself to a loot lockout would only pose a problem if, say, you were in a weekend guild and that was your main guild, but you also rated in a weekly guild, like a Tuesday type of
Mm.
guild, and because you go into their raid first of the week, like that, assigning it to you to their lockout essentially, right? They could obviously find many different ways around it, but
Hmm.
the concept that we should be able to pull mythic bosses the same way that we do with heroic is entirely desirable. I have wanted nothing more than to just get the duplicative experience of Resto Shaman, my own class, in those two raids. I definitely would do that if I could.
I
Um,
also think that kind of plays into the holding the raid hostage stuff. Like, because going and getting a tier set, for example, for you or whatever, in one of the weeks that we were early in Mythic progression, I think there is a difference where you're doing that, but you go and you know that you're getting a tier token to drop from the boss guaranteed. You're getting two of them, so there's like a pretty good chance. I also think it would help if, because that's a lot more likely to, like, you go in there, you get the loot, you've got the tier token now, and you're done. And it's like, and it's a big upgrade. It's whatever, 10% throughput or something for some people. Whereas going and getting like a trinket from Prototype Pantheon or whatever is like it's maybe a 2% DPS increase for that person, and it's like there's so many other items and people that it's not even guaranteed that that piece of loot drops in the first place, let alone two of them that you could potentially trade around and things like that. So I think some way of maybe saying like you can block a boss from appearing from giving loot for you so that it's more likely on other people, or blocking it from your great vault, or making choosing a boss that guaranteed one of their items appears in your great vault, like some way to make the loot acquisition more player controlled. And I think season 4 is doing this. Like I said, I'm very excited for that because I think this does solve a lot of these issues in sort of a roundabout way. It doesn't really change the experiencing the boss problem, but it changes like the motivation to go back to the boss versus extending and just progressing kind of thing, which is loot is kind of like a one step abstraction of that motivation, I guess, rather than just experiencing the boss just to have practice on it. Um, so I think season 4 does do a good step in addressing some parts of it, but not entirely.
Yeah, the concept that they're bringing into season 4 is really interesting to me. Like I went through all of Castle Nathria with heroic kills every week that I could, probably starting midway through the tiers, something like that, right? When it was
Mhm.
entirely puggable and entirely reasonable, you could kill it on two different shamans and never once got a Kabbalist hymnal, right?
Yep,
That concept of being able to obtain that item very, very early into the tier is enticing for sure. I do think that it will feel terrible if everybody in the group were to say choose Kabbalah's hymnal. Because like that's something Guild will have to consider now too. Like let's just say all the people that could get Kabbalah's hymnal all choose that just because it's, best trinket, whatever.
right,
Then you're gonna go into the raid and if one ever drops, that's gonna feel really, really bad. So
right.
there needs to be some form of protection there. And I very much want to see this loot system that they provide in this season maybe make its way into future seasons for sure.
Definitely. Yeah, I do think there should be some way where you can say our raid has killed this boss X amount of times already. We have already got enough of this item for all of our current raiders and players that we're bringing to raid or whatever, characters that we're bringing to raid, even if it's alts. And we don't want any more of this item. Like I feel like you should be able to say that as a player, that like when you first kill the boss, you're probably not going to say that unless they've just done a really bad job making the items. And like there's a completely worthless trinket for every DPS class in spec somehow. But realistically, the first time you kill a boss, you're going to want all of the items to be available. And then after you start getting duplicates of like two or three of the same item, then you can start blocking it out and saying, we don't want any more of this item anymore, especially for the items that are available to every spec, where rings, necklaces, that you just get like 30 of them over the course of a tier, probably more than that. Whereas an item like a trinket or a two-handed weapon or a bow, you get like two in the entire tier. And it's like the the difference between getting 40 of an item versus getting two of it over the course of an entire season is just way too extreme, where it should be closer to like it's okay if it's maybe 10 to 20 or something, but um because then you also have the other issue where if people don't have a hunter in the raid with personal loot currently they can't drop the ranged weapons. But it also means that if you're the only hunter in the raid, you're only getting like you have to get the weapon yourself. You can't trade it from anybody else. Whereas a lot of other specs, you can trade weapons between them and things like that. So there's a whole bunch of issues with the way item and loot works that season 4 does help a little bit because you're able to target the items and upgrade them from the lower tier versions so that you can, if you don't get the item on mythic, you can at least still upgrade it if you're killing enough mythic bosses, but you have the heroic or normal version, which I think helps a lot. But it also means that people are having to clear very trivial content for them, being heroic and normal, like repeatedly over and over again just to get an item, rather than the actual challenging content that kind of matches their skill level. So I don't think it's a perfect solution, but it's at least way better than what we currently have. So I'm still very
Yeah,
it's in the positive direction at least.
and I agree with you. I gotta mute you because got, but yeah, we're good. And I'll, if I were to throw this up there, I would just mute that out. But like I muted you in the stream, for example. But
Yeah.
so the the one thing that interests me though, and I want to play devil's advocate from a casual perspective, is like the barriers for that, the concept that like you could block a piece from not dropping. Because let's just imagine you are a pug group leader, you add a bunch of people to your group, and you block out every piece of loot that isn't DK loot or whatever the leader is. Right? You basically ensure that your loot is dropping. There obviously has to be a lot of safeguards for that just to
Well,
ensure that there aren't issues.
if you're a
Right?
pug leader and you have, uh, I don't know, let's say a feral druid versus a warrior signing up, and you're a DK, chances are you're probably taking, like, if you're already incentivized by making sure more loot drops for yourself and things like that, you're already incentivized to take probably the mythic raiders that are joining your pug in heroic because they can trade most of the items already, and then probably your same armor type and things like that compared to the feral druid. So like a lot of that I think already happens with pug leaders to an extent, um, but I'm not sure that it's not like a new problem. It maybe just is a further expansion of the same current problem which exists, which is like pugs are incentivized to make their group not just of the best players that or the first people that sign up, but they're
That's true.
incentivized by the way the loot system works to maybe pick and choose certain people over others and stuff. So
I I agree with you. I do think that, you know, from the devious casuals perspective, right? They would essentially like they don't even need to do that whole process of bringing in all the people that match their loot, and that idea that they could just bring anybody but then lock it out. You'll have a bunch of casuals that just weren't even aware of it. So yeah, I hear you. I'm just very interested in the safeguards that they would put in place just to ensure that the casual doesn't get screwed over in that event, right? I know it just it's leaning towards that concept of master loot, right?
mm-hmm.
Which they are very clearly against.
It's
But
also maybe something that you would only enable in Mythic or something like that, or only enable in a pre-made group that's, whatever, 16 plus people of the same guild or something like that. That's what they've done in the past for Master Loot to
yeah,
make sure that pugs don't abuse that stuff. So I think there's probably a way to figure it out where it works for guilds and works for pugs, because a lot of times the stuff that's better safeguards for pugs also unfortunately means that guilds kind of aren't able to have as much control, and I'm generally not a fan of that.
yeah, and even just looking at the loot next tier, not that we've or no, I'm sorry, like for Dragonflight and whatnot, not that any of that's been released or anything like that, but I do see Scarzard on Twitter, exclaiming that he's developed some very interesting trinkets, um, and I'm kind of excited to see what comes of that. But I'm interested in what you've thought of kind of the loot this tier, because you had the benefit of your legendary bow dropping off of Sylvanas. I'm sure that was a pretty cool experience up until you got the ability.
Uh, yes and no. The legendary bow last year was weird because, um, it only dropped for hunters, like I said previously, and it didn't drop from the Great Vault at all, and it didn't. Once you had it, you couldn't drop it again, so you couldn't get duplicates and trade it around either and help other people get their bow. Um, And so, yeah, I went the whole tier last year through CE progression using the heroic version of the bow. I got that pretty early on, luckily for me. Got that like I think week 3 of the raid being out or something like that.
Yeah, that's right. I remember.
And because I was Kyrian also, the 1 minute CD of resonating arrow, which gives you a big crit buff and damage buff, uh, also aligned up perfectly with the 1 minute wailing arrow cooldown. And wailing arrow was your hardest hitting cast basically, and so you would sync those up every time. And it was like in some other covenants, it was better to be using a mythic item level bow over the legendary one at heroic item level. But for Kieran specifically, the heroic one was BIS until you got the mythic version. And then I didn't get the mythic version until like the week before the tier was over, which I was not a fan of because I had killed the end boss Sylvanas like 12 times at that point, and it was like 3 months of killing the same boss, only needing one item at that point from her, and just going every week over and over and making zero effective progress on it. It was very annoying. I wish they would have just upped it to 100% drop rate past a certain point. Um, and then this tier again, just because of my class and the weapon not being as available and things like that. I'm still using a heroic item level weapon into Mythic right now, and we're on Jailer, and I'll probably kill Jailer before I get a Mythic item level weapon. That's also on me because I wasn't doing Mythic boxes as often anymore. After I did them for like the first, whatever, 10, 12 weeks of the patch or something, but after like 2 or 3 months of doing that in a row, I was like, I'm done now. Especially, and I went on vacation at the around the same time, so
That's
uh,
true. Yeah.
yeah.
I've taken the opposite approach. I've made sure that every piece that I could possibly get I have. And with how leech works for healers, it's made me wear some annoying pieces that like kind of
Mm-hmm.
shortened the amount of loot that I actually needed to get. But yeah, I very much just kind of focus on having the best gear that I can, just because it's kind of like outside a raid, even though I raid 5 days a week. What am I gonna do in the game right now, right? Like they gave us the very early um grind for Exalted Rep, just so you could get your augment runes, which I'm not even sure if you have that. I don't
I do
think that
not.
you do. Yep,
Nope.
that.
It was revered for the Unity craft thing. That was the main thing.
Yep, you're right there. It and it did cost a lot of
Augment runes
gold.
just cost gold. Yeah.
Well, and the runes itself, like it was interesting to me because I didn't have the Veil Augment rune or whatever, or the Infinite one on
Mhm.
my alt, and so I've been having to buy those. And I have spent over the course of Lords of Dread, Rygalon, and the start of Jailer the same amount that would have cost me to just buy the Infinite one, and so now I'm
Mhm.
like at a deficit, right? And then
Right. It
until I
definitely
get it.
saves money if you were motivated to continue doing the dailies and stuff for the rep. I was just not motivated to do that.
Yep, I'm not shocked, nor do I blame you. It's definitely wasn't a very fun thing, but it was also one of those things of that's kind of the only content that they had
Oh,
provided.
here's a fun aspect. I'm pretty sure we would have had, or I would have had, Exalted by this point if extending the lockouts worked differently because the bosses give a lot of rep when you kill them. And because we've been extending for so long, I haven't been getting rep every week from the bosses. And so I would have been Exalted, I think, a month or two ago if we
That's
had actually been full clearing uh, up to the boss that we were progressing on every week. But because we're extending lockouts, that's not the case. So
yeah.
that's
Does
a,
every boss give rep? I know
I
that the
think each
jailer
boss gives
does.
like 500 or something. Yeah.
Okay, yeah, yeah. It is an
it
interesting
it adds up
thought.
a lot. I
Where
could technically like do heroic pugs to get it, but like
yeah, you're not gonna
that's
do that.
similar to doing dailies to me. Yeah.
Yeah, you're not doing that.
So
You can also, just so you know, kill LFR jailer, which they have nerfed heavily. Um,
yeah, I think I would
and
rather do dailies than LFR though.
yeah, but I mean, just kind of tying it all the way back to the raid nerfs that we were talking about earlier, or touched on at least. We're in a very weird spot, where next time we go to reclear, normally like we'll have a little bit of trouble on certain bosses. I think we'll be entirely shocked with just how far these bosses were driven into the ground. And
Yeah.
I'm not saying that Anduin's just going to fall over first pull for us or anything like that. The things that made it difficult, or the things that we were wiping to, some of which are still around for sure. And if we see any change in group composition that we bring to the boss, then yeah, we're definitely going to feel that. But that uh the concept that next time we see these things that they just kind of fall over. At least some of them certainly will. Like Halandris has been nerfed even further since we saw our kill like 5 pulls into the 30-second bombs, excuse me.
Yep.
So
Yeah, I think he's lost like 10% HP since then or something too. Yeah.
yeah, he's lost a lot of HP in that he saw bugs in his P3 where you couldn't see some things, some
Yep.
visuals. So glad that we weren't
That's
progressing at that
that's
time.
the type of stuff that makes me worried for Dragonflight, man.
Yeah, it is an interesting concept. Um, But I personally I love farm. I think that we've talked about it before. You enjoy farm to an extent, right?
I definitely like farm. I like gearing up alts and being able to play them because I always kind of compare them to my main, where, for example, if my main has whatever 30% crit and 30% mastery and things like that, it's like my alt, if I gear them up, I'm comparing myself to people that are able to play when like the specs have a certain level of stats and gear and things like that, and like the rotations kind of work differently. This is more, I think, a thing for DPS specs, but a lot of the DPS specs do kind of feel dependent on hitting certain stat breakpoints and things like that. And if you're gearing an alt, either you might not even have the stat distributions, like if Mastery and Crit are your best stats, you might have half of your pieces are like haste first pieces just because they're just the best item level or whatever. Whereas when you're actually playing the character a lot more dedicated and getting so much more pieces of the same item level, you actually have the ability to optimize for stats in that way and things like that. But also just having lower item level and less stats in general, it just makes the rotations feel less fluid to play and things like that, and less like you can't learn the rotation as properly in terms of timings and stuff like that. Especially with so many like cooldown reduction effects, especially in Shadowlands, I feel like that a lot of specs have um, that it all kind of compounds, and so I feel like it's not really worth learning or playing an alt until I'm like reclearing Mythic Farm to actually get them like the item level of gear that makes them play properly, kind of, if that makes sense.
Yeah, and this
And then I also just like parsing and chasing ranks on my main character a little bit. I like challenging myself to be competitive with the top logs and things like that. So
Yeah, that's entirely reasonable. I think that as a healer in farm, that's something very similar. During the kills, it's whatever will get the kill, and then after that, kind of showing whatever you're capable of. That's entirely reasonable, right? But this whole concept that this tier, like as much as we're going to have season 4, where we'll see these bosses again and whatnot, that it's gonna be a fairly short farm period, just given how short they've cut it and how long they made the tier last, at least, right? Because we don't have a season 4 release date, but we do know when season 4 is gonna end. Essentially, like if you just assume that very end of December, you've got a window of 5 months now, right? Like,
mm-hmm.
so they need to make season 4 last long enough that it's not frustrating, like we talked about, where people need to hit certain thresholds where they want to get CE of something. How long is it reasonable for them to progress something where they have to see it once every 3 weeks to even see progression, right? Like if we are, let's just say we're progressing SLG 1 week and then the reset happens and now we're back into Sanctum. And we don't get to see SLG again for a couple of weeks, and by the time we get back there, half of our time is spent just relearning what it was that we remembered, right?
I do think because we're gaining another tier of item level and stuff like that, I do think I think the kind of plan might be the first time you see the the raid or whatever, like the first rotation around each time, you maybe get 75% of the way through or something, and then you're gearing up from all the mythic bosses that you cleared 75% of the way through on like the first rotation around of each three, and then the next time you come around you outgear it enough to where you get 90% or all the way through it on the second time around, and like the third time around you definitely overgear it by that point. Basically, I think the gear outgearing like progression curve will accelerate the progression through the raid a lot faster in this tier, kind of through the loot acquisition stuff, being able to target certain pieces that are big upgrades for you, and the creation catalyst and stuff like that I think is sticking around and having tier sets. I've also liked that this tier you are able to have more pieces with tertiaries, I feel like, because you're able to upgrade them in the catalyst and things like that, where they don't just go to waste because they weren't a tier piece. You can actually use them if they procced leech or avoidance or whatever. So I've liked that as well, having the creation catalyst as a tool to be able to get more tertiaries on your gear.
Yeah, it's honestly been super nice. Um, and like there's the concept of what they did with your extra loot that you didn't want to take from the vault, where you'd be able to buy sockets. That was super cool. I think the next step might be being able to add tertiaries to stats. That would increase the cap at which your character could attain, for sure. That would give more reason to play, because you're playing until you get leech on every piece or something like that, and there's a concept of tuning around that. But I think that's a pretty cool concept one of our raiders mentioned when we were like waiting to pull the boss or something. That was kind of cool.
Mm-hmm. I do think it would be good. Like I like being able to get like bis for my character and just having a clear endpoint where there is no more upgrades. But at the same time, it might be better for the game overall to still have like a way to improve your character very minorly in that aspect, like getting leech or avoidance, but not really DPS throughput upgrades by that point or something like that. So I think that's maybe a good way to still have people who want to invest in their character further and keep playing them to be able to still feel like that's making some sort of progress and worthwhile compared to people who are just they just start playing alts by that point once their main character gets bis or something. So
Yeah, it does feel like we are pretty much at bis minus your weapon right now, right? So there's and
yeah,
the
I think I
jailer
have
loot.
two or three pieces still that are heroic, but that's it. Yeah.
Yeah, all of which would be shored up by going through a
Yeah,
re-clear,
one or
hopefully.
two farm weeks, I think, yeah, covers that pretty much.
Yeah. And yeah, it's a question of just how many farm weeks we really will have. Because like, what day do you think season 4 would be released on?
Ooh, that's a good question. I think, hmm,
I mean, if you need time to think about
I
it,
think late August is probably
late August. Okay, yeah,
mid to late August. So like the 16th, 23rd, or 30th, one of those three probably for the season 4 start date would be
yeah,
my guess.
that's entirely reasonable. It is, uh, it's scary because the guild that we are in has somewhat maintained its kind of same ranking, you know, uh,
Hmm.
going through. So like, if we end up killing the other one, we'll probably be right around US-200 as the guild has been pretty consistently this tier or this expansion at least, right? And far less rekills of jailer than we would have seen of rekills of Sylve. That's for sure. I know that we've got season 4 around the corner, but that's always a tricky subject because we obviously want to bring the same group that we brought to each of um the bosses on farm that we brought to the very first kill, at least for that first week, just to make sure that it goes as smoothly as possible. And it's kind of like asking ourselves, like, well, we are against the clock, and we do need to get every raider CE, and we do need to get every raider a kill on each boss. You know, like that's important to us as well. So at least this time around, it feels like we're kind of up against the ropes.
Mm,
Um,
I know what you mean. Yeah.
a lot of people won't view a season 4 kill as matching what our goals are, at least. You know.
Yep. I definitely can see that. I'm definitely the kind of person where, for example, if I don't know, Skolex, like if I wasn't in on the first kill for Skolex and it didn't drop any items that I needed at this point, I wouldn't feel any real need to go and kill Skolex. Um,
Because it's so early.
if people still needed gear from him, if it was just like, I mean, yeah, because he's so early. If people didn't need gear from him anymore, I would want to kill him for ranking purposes. But that's just
Hmm.
me. But if it was like people still need gear on that boss and we had 20 people that needed gear and I don't, but I didn't have a kill on him, I wouldn't feel a pressure that I want to kill that boss. It's a little bit different for like if I wasn't in on Jailer, I would definitely want to kill Jailer, obviously. And same for like Lords, uh, Anduin, Raglan, Helandris, like the main hard bosses of the tier. But a lot of the earlier bosses I would be fine skipping, I think, if I just never got around to killing them.
Yeah. And it's a weird tier because re-clear it's entirely reasonable to underheal these bosses with how much they've been nerfed and all of this. So we might just see massive composition changes when we go back through. We don't really know, right? It might make more sense. I know that because the way that Lords was nerfed, you actually like overheal it now. It's entirely reasonable to 6 heal it just because it makes the fight cleaner in that
Consistent,
regard.
yeah.
Yeah, more consistent. I don't know. I'm interested in what the farm period's like. I'm very interested in season 4. I personally intend to kind of explore all that season 4 has to offer. I've always loved playing as much as possible. Um, and the thought of being able to just kind of get this extra mini season, almost like a mini raid, I guess you could argue. Um, like this extra set of gear as we go into Dragonflight could be really cool.
So here's an interesting question for you. If you or I, for example, got Dragonflight Beta or Alpha, would you think you would play that more than Season 4?
Oh, the
Not
timing.
necessarily, not necessarily at the exclusion of the other one, but just like in terms of after you had your done, 9 allotted weekly raid hours or whatever for the week. Like, what would you be doing in your free time? Would you think you would play Shadowflight or Dragonflight
Hmm.
alpha
Um, it's
or focus on
interesting.
season 4 characters?
Yeah, it's interesting to me because it depends on what would be available even Dragonflight. Because like
Hmm.
I know some people like to take that time and try to find the best way to like level through it so that they can get through it as quick as possible or
Hmm.
whatever extent of that that there is. I think that I'm not the biggest in terms of physical research of like going through because as a healer it makes things a little bit weird being able
Yeah,
to test
healer, you are
beta.
kind of dependent on other people a lot too, I think.
Yeah, and I can't in an alpha or something like that, I wouldn't be able to reasonably go in and experience any event where I'd be able to test it. I would say though that if they had the evoker available to play, I think that you'd see me spending more time on the alpha for sure, just kind of
Hmm.
learning about it, practicing it, even if it's like just in a random dungeon or whatever it is, just to kind of get used to it because it's important to me to be able to know how each and every healer works and their strengths and weaknesses and at least if we ended up having an evoker in the group to be able to speak on it from experience, because just speaking blindly feels rough. Like when I was chatting with Beto about Shadow Priest, I literally had to say to him multiple times, I have no clue how Shadow Priest works, but
Right.
X, Y, and Z, right?
Right.
But I think that I would still probably be more heavily invested on live, unless there were a lot of people that I knew in alpha. How about you?
Um, yeah, so like I don't know about alpha, but beta, the stuff I would expect is like basically all the leveling, questing stuff, and then probably the main dungeons that are in at launch. And I think you could probably do them on Keystone stuff too. But then like the raids wouldn't be available, um,
Yeah.
except for at the certain like raid testing times that they'll announce beforehand or whatever. But I would
Yeah.
probably, I feel like I would play them about equally, probably. Like I would probably play beta a decent amount at the start and like figured out how my class is going to work and what the talent trees look like and stuff like that. But then depends on, I mean, it depends on when the you got the beta access and how close it was to launch and stuff, I guess. But I feel like after a little while of doing that, I would probably just go back to focusing on season 4 stuff. Like after maybe a month of having beta, I would you would kind of have done pretty much everything and have gotten the gist of everything you wanted to look at from there. So,
Yeah, I'm and kind of speaking of the you spoke about the talent system right then there. I'm honestly shocked that it's taken them this long to release some of their other ideas on other classes. Like we've just seen DK and Druid, right? That's like literally a sixth of the classes that we're expecting. I would obviously love to see them give more, because if they continue at this pace, uh, or at least they try to mimic it, then you might be receiving your hunter tree only like less than a month before it goes live, right?
yep.
Or something like that. Or like, do we see them on alpha whenever alpha is released? I know there might be like a closed alpha, whatnot. Are they available there? Because that's a really big aspect of this game. I know it's really important to you as well because you know,
Yeah, well, it's weird to me because like even if they're not finished right now and they're not happy with where they currently are, I feel like what's the harm in releasing them and just getting the feedback that tells you like specifically what's wrong with them that like you already maybe know half of it, but then you can fix it. But at least it's there for people to like know kind of what to expect and they're not because it definitely feels worse for me to just be completely in the dark the whole time and be like are they even working on this at all like is my class going to be yeah is it going to be the last one is it going to be rushed out the door and probably broken in some way because they got around to it last whereas they didn't like they could just have had it sitting up for a month or two and available, and people could tell them exactly what was wrong with it and exactly what needed fixing, and then they could fix that stuff and then get it out the door in time. When they finally had a chance to actually get around to fixing it, even if they don't have time right now to focus on it or something. I don't know. It's weird. Um, because I feel like even if things weren't in the exact right place or they didn't have exactly the right things in exactly the right order, like I feel like it's not that hard to shift stuff around and rebalance it. Like we've already seen some feedback of that on the talent trees that they've released, so it's not like they're releasing them and they're perfect. It's like they're releasing them and they might still need some tweaks. So why not just release them anyway if you're expecting to need to tweak them anyway? I don't know. It seems weird to withhold them back, I guess, if they're not. And it doesn't seem like they would take long to create at all either from scratch. Like,
With what we've seen, right?
yeah,
Like
like a person that plays the class could probably do it in a decent enough way in a pretty short period of time, I would think. So yeah, it's weird.
yeah, I can theorize about what would be on the shaman tree, but honestly, like I feel like it's just gonna be a lot of the abilities that we've already seen, right? Like
Mm-hmm.
they basically are with Druid, with DK, they're just slightly giving them a bit more than they would have had, or like the potential to. But a lot of what you're picking is just stuff that you've already had. If they
So
repeat that, then it's gonna be a little iffy in my mind.
yeah, my one tinfoil theory is that they might be reworking specs. Like I'm thinking of like Havoc Demon Hunter, for example, where like right now you don't use Blade Dance at all, and that's just like weird. And a lot of Havoc players are uh, very vocal that that shouldn't be the way it is, and things like that. And so they might be reworking the specs that don't have talent trees yet because they're trying to figure out how their spec is going to work in the future, and they're reworking some aspect of the spec. And so they released like Druid and DK because those were the classes where they had all the specs in a way that they liked for the most part and that they weren't going to change drastically, whereas some of the ones that they're holding back, like they might be changing things about how those specs and classes work, even if it's just like certain spells, like a one certain core rotational spell or whatever. It's like figuring out how that fits into everything else and what the talents that affect it are now that it's not an optional like build around thing that you have to specifically spec for, stuff like that. So that's my one sort of like way that it makes some sense, but I don't know. It's definitely
Yeah,
that's definitely not the case for all of the other classes though. Like maybe a few that's the case, but not all of them. So yeah, it's still weird.
I wonder if they're spending more time trying to make a Voker great, and that is a fear of mine. Like, there's a very common thought that it's like, if Evoker gets this really big touch to it, or at least a healing spec of it, preservation, if that's like an emphasis for them, and Mistweaver doesn't see some changes, like it's
Right.
pretty widely regarded that Mistweaver is just like the worst of the bunch, not in terms of output or anything like that, but just
But
strictly off
playstyle,
of
yeah.
design. Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah, they clearly need to take another look at this poor class, something that I used to main a long time ago. And um it's pushed me so far. It's like I don't even maintain that. Like I've always held this idea that I'll maintain each healer class to at least be able to play them to some degree, but it's just like not even fun to try.
Mm-hmm.
So I am fearful that they are kind of digging themselves a hole. It's a little too big. I know that obviously, right? You know that this time frame isn't one that they would have requested. Obviously, if they have more time to work on something before putting it out, that's definitely what they would do, right?
Yeah,
But
I don't think it was like entirely their decision to try and release it within
yeah,
2022 for sure.
but then I also see some things where some of the developers on Twitter are like, yeah, no, we can get it out in that time. Like it's not even a hint of fear or anything like that, and some of that might be required as to what they need to say based on
I
the
was gonna say,
company
I also
guidelines.
I also remember hearing like, no, covenants being locked to not be changeable. It will work out fine. It's not going to be an issue. No, conduit energy won't be annoying. It'll be fine. Like it's it's a non-issue for the 99% of players and things like that. And like I remember hearing those things, and I don't necessarily trust what I hear a lot because
Yeah,
yeah, I don't know how much of it they're either they truly believe and they just aren't aware of the actual issues of, or they're not ignorant. I feel like that's a very kind of accusatory, like mean spirited whatever term for it, but like maybe
oblivious.
accidentally oblivious, yeah, something like that.
Yeah.
Um oblivious to, or I think whether they're like pressured from above to like say that it is ready when they do have those fears and they do see the problems with stuff. I don't know, but um I sympathize. I sympathize with them regardless. um I mean, I think we're all on the same team. Like we all want the game to be good, kind of. That's always my kind of philosophy, is like I want the game to be fun. I don't want the devs to be overworked and stressed and like rushing stuff out the door either. And have a normal, sane, good work environment. Um, I don't want the game to just be rushed out the door and be unfinished. I want it to be fun. I want it to be good. Um, yeah, and so it's like I'm all in the same team, but also like I do also have standards that like as a person that plays the game, I'm not just going to accept it if it's like not ready and the stuff doesn't work properly and there's clearly flaws with the like philosophical direction that the game is going kind of at the same time. And so like I do criticize that sometimes, but yeah.
So I agree with you, but I'll be honest. I think if they came out with the covenant system, it's tough to say after just experiencing it. But if they came out with a covenant system and conduit energy and all of that, you'd still catch me playing 10.0. Like we
I would
are,
still play it probably, yeah. But
yeah,
I know
and
there's a lot of people who wouldn't at the same time. Like I'm not necessarily the rule that proves or the exception that proves the rule or something like I don't know.
yeah. No, no, I hear you, and I guess what I'm just trying to say is, there's definitely things that they can do to make the game better. And I definitely agree that opening up this whole covenant system and allowing me to play more optimally was enjoyable. Like it just feels better to play more optimally, right? Like you want to see your damage numbers a lot higher. Good example is like I played Necrolord from the start, right? Necrolord was not the best in anything outside of raid necessarily. Like you could argue it was good for PvP, Shaman's weird state. Um, it was not the best in dungeons for sure. All it did was make you heal. Like you weren't really doing crazy damage. And then when they opened up the floodgates and I was able to play my Vesper Totem Kyrian, it felt a lot more comfortable to get into groups I was actually desired because like well my class normally could have exceeded that. I was finally brought and all those things.
Mhm.
But I also don't think it was that bad for me just because I focused so much on raid. I was gonna take whatever build was best for raid, and it wasn't differing between bosses. So it's difficult for me to have that same perspective I think that you do. But I do fully like understand it. I very much hope that they take these concepts that they've started to show ever since what was it, 915, where they kind of
Mhm.
started to care a bit more about it felt like they cared a bit more about what the community was saying, or at least going along with it, right?
Mhm.
I
Yep.
think that we could definitely bring that forward into Dragonflight. We haven't seen a system yet that we strongly disagree with or anything like that. We haven't seen much of Dragonflight, to be honest. So far, all we've seen is like this concept of flying, right?
Yeah.
Like
I mean, I feel like
that's
it's you'd
yeah,
have to mess with flying like pretty hard to make it some sort of way that I would like not play the expansion over. Like at worst, it's going to be something that I just tolerate getting around with for a few months, and then you'll have regular flying afterwards or something. So
yeah.
yeah,
I
I'm not worried about that really.
yeah. I'm in the same boat, but it's also like that fear of like, well, we don't really know what's coming. We know an evoker class is coming.
I was
Whenever
gonna
a new
say
class comes, they're broken. But go ahead.
also because we haven't seen that stuff, and from my uh kind of vibe from what I'm getting from their messaging and things like that is like we shouldn't be expecting much else aside from the talent trees. So that's why it kind of seems especially important to me that they get them in the hands and eyes of the players like early so that they can fix the issues with it, because if they get that right, that's all they have to do is just get that one thing right, and then the rest of the expansion will hopefully be
And
pretty
the
good.
raid tuning. And the raid
Yeah,
tuning. Like
yeah, that's true. I mean, tier sets
there's
and tier bonuses, like those will also be important too, but like yeah,
tuning.
it's like if you didn't know what the covenant powers were, like all of the lead up to Shadowlands, and then Shadowlands is coming out, and it's like surprise, this is what the Karain Soulbind does, and you're like, that's Omega broken on half of these boss fights. Like, how are you balancing this? Do I have to go Night Fae now? Like, why didn't I be able to test this the whole time? And like, now it needs rebalancing because Naya is overpowered for Night Fae druids and
Yeah,
like all that type of stuff. So
yeah. Well,
yeah,
so yeah, this whole concept of tuning, I do like the thought that very much taking a step back that that I agree. It's like there's just one thing that they really have to get right. And tuning in and of itself is all a part of that. They're gonna lose a lot of the borrowed power that we've got, the tier set changes, like all those little aspects. But my hope, based on what we've heard, is like that there really isn't anything else. That if they choose to make the number of variables lower than the past, I think that's already like in the right direction. Um, I I know a more recent topic, just solely based off of these warlock changes and the timings of them. We could kind of transition over to that. Like
Sure.
it's shown us a bit that they're definitely not in touch with the community, because I think everybody would agree that these warlock changes were warranted, but just now is probably the worst time. Like you've got the MDI right around the corner, you've got all these
Yep.
people that are about to compete that have been practicing with these busted warlocks essentially. A warlock in every group, but to the extent that you can't have two in the MDI, right? That
Right.
is their limit to it. So you do have to find two other classes, most likely Windwalker and Survival Hunter with the way that things are going. But
Yep.
you're kind of bound to that experience, and I don't like the concept of them basically capping the keystone level early. Like you're basically saying
Yeah.
for this patch at least, there's no way you're going to be able to get further than you already did, even with
Right.
optimizations. Like it's
Yes.
just not going to be possible.
Yep.
And I think that everybody is a big fan of more frequent tuning, absolutely, but at the right times, because one of the things that I was hearing was there is that barrier of how big is that tuning to the point that you're shifting the meta, because you've got people that are going to be playing their classes and they want to be able to experience them the way that they're expecting, right? Somebody that goes and levels a warlock and gears it up. Perfect example is me. I was just gearing my warlock. It was just hitting 255. I was about to experience that incredibly fun experience. I literally had two set, was about to have four, right? I won't get to see that play style anymore, and that's okay. But I understand why they don't nerf so heavily earlier into the tier, or why they've gone back on tuning that they've done. I think that they just need to take a different approach to it entirely.
Yeah, I mean, I think this tier being hard and long as well was a lot of the reasoning why they didn't do earlier tuning, because they didn't want to affect people still progressing into Mythic that much. And I think now that they've started nerfing the bosses a lot more regularly on Mythic, and by very pretty major amounts of nerfs, like they're not just minor stuff. A lot of times it's like a pretty major different change to the fight of like how a core mechanic works, or just like a massive amount of boss HP being gone, like 5 or 10% or something. And so I think now that they started doing that, now that they're kind of allowing themselves to do those nerfs, and so they were, it's like I think they would have done this nerf a lot sooner if the raid wasn't as hard and people had been progressing in the raid a lot more quickly, and more guilds had gotten CE by this point, so that they weren't feeling like they were affecting people that were still progressing in the raid and stuff. Um,
Yeah, yeah, I hear
so
that.
that's one aspect. I To me, it's like when you're going from whatever warlock is now to like a 20% DPS nerf overnight, like there's just no way that that's not going to feel awful for not only every warlock player but every person who plays with a warlock, like which is basically the entire population of the game. And so like instead of going overnight from 0 to 20% nerf, if you had instead over the past whatever 4 or 5 months, if you had been every 2 weeks, we're knocking off 1%, or 2% or something like that, then it's like each overnight change is like a pretty minor difference. And like, yeah, they still need to be brought down. Yeah, they're still top DPS. Yeah, they still need to be brought down. But at least it would have been more gradual. And over the course of the season, going from the previous 2 or 3 weeks, 4 weeks to now, it was like maybe you lost 2 or 4% DPS on your Warlock. But that's not the difference between I can time a 32 and now I can't time at 32 anymore for the rest of the season because Warlock took a 20% nerf. It's like, was the Warlock doing 2% or 4% more damage? The difference between us timing the 32 versus the 33? Like, maybe, maybe not, but at least you can still maybe push for the 33, like, as the season is going on. So, like, because MDI is, I think, a minority of the population. Like, I do sympathize to some extent for the people that are playing competitively. I've played competitively in the past, and I do think to some extent being able to adapt to a change in the meta and patches and things like that, it's a little bit different because I was playing a MOBA, but and patches were a bit more regular and expected to that point. Um, so the way I took it was like it was part of the skill expression of the game was being able to adapt to the changes and figure out the new meta as the patches came through. Whereas So I do sympathize with the MDI people, but I think yeah, the bigger aspect is all the people pushing keys on the live normal version of the game are also massively affected by this towards the end of the season, and like that shouldn't happen. I feel like where keys are just now artificially capped to whatever you've done by this point, pretty much, and you
Yeah.
can't probably go higher than that anymore. Yeah,
I um I mean, it's important to me to always play devil's advocate, right? And I need to understand why it is that they would ever consider not doing something like this, right? And I wonder if it's because their developers are so focused, like maybe the people that they have that are looking into Warlock or whatever are working on how they play out in Dragonflight, right?
yep.
And the concept, it's like, well, if that's really the case, I would much rather them try to get the next one right as opposed to the current one. Personally, that's just what I would
I
want.
I agree with you. However, I think it's a false choice because Blizzard is a like multi-billion-dollar company, and they should have a person working on the next expansion and a person ensuring that the current season is also balanced correctly at the same time. And they should, if it requires two people, they should have two separate people doing it. like
Yeah,
I, I don't like making an excuse for them to just make one portion of the game worse. Like I feel like they should just invest in making the game the best game, and that will be it'll pay for itself in terms of like personnel. Obviously, like making the game better keeps people playing for longer, giving them more subscriptions, more WoW tokens or whatever, like buying more shot mounts. Like it definitely pays for itself to invest in the game and making the game better, and so just do that. And it makes everybody happier and have a more fun game both in the meantime and in the future. And so I just don't like ever having any I don't see any excuse that like rationally makes sense for why they would not do that
yeah.
to me.
The only
It's
other
hard for me
thing,
to understand.
yeah, the only other thing that I could think of is you think of fucking Joe, who is just going through his key as a warlock, and the highest key he's ever done is a 10, and he's gonna go try his 11, and he's super excited because he's a purple class and he's getting taken to this silly Mists 11 or whatever, right?
Yep.
And the nerfs come through, and suddenly people don't care that much that he's a purple class, and the concept that among from my own experience, uh obviously skill has a significant benefit to how a class can be played. Like a good example is right now I think boomkins are like among the lowest right now of damage or something like that, right? Like I know
I
our
think
boomkins
they're
have been crying.
yeah, I think they're fine for like single target, but in the raid specifically where there's a lot of like cleave target swap fights and stuff like that, they're either the lowest or among the like bottom 3 lowest for the raid overall. Yeah.
Right. And if I'm looking at two people playing the game and I see that a balance druid is doing more than a demo lock in single target or whatever, right? I would entirely expect that to be like a lower tier guild, but that happens every day, right?
Mhm.
Like you've experienced it in raids that we've been in together where people that should not have been out DPSing others certainly will, or certainly were, right?
Mhm.
And I think that um we obviously look at the more competitive scene, but there's obviously a much larger population of the game that is a lower tier in
Mhm.
general. People that where this change would affect them. And I mean there's always that meme of like, well, maybe there was a warlock player that's highly ranked in Blizzard and he wants to experience it that way, right? Like there have been classes that have been consistently playing super well across multiple tiers. Warlock being one of them. I think Mage was another. That
Yeah. I think
especially in
generally
PvP.
the classes that have 3 DPS specs, like generally one of them is going to be competitive to some extent. Um and especially Mage and Warlock, where like they bring a raid buff and raid utility of like Gateway and Hellstones and like Arcane Intellect and stuff like that, or Time Warp and all that type of stuff. I think that especially helps them a lot. Um, but
And
yeah,
I think that Max publicizing a bit more about how it is that he goes about developing his raid composition has definitely affected their thought process going forward. I think it's pretty clear based on the developers he's said that have reached out to him, about these these changes and whatnot. Like he's mentioned offhand, essentially. Um, we've seen people reference his videos and whatnot, like the whole AMZ type of
Yep.
thing that happened, right?
I remember Preach got blamed for that too because he asked it to Ian in a
Yeah,
Q&A. Yeah.
yeah. So it's like this, that maybe their philosophy might be changing, or at least that's my hope, that they understand that, well, X, Y, and Z class brings massive utility. It's okay for them not to be at the top of the charts. Like a good example is right now, Holy Paladin does not do a lot of healing. But if
Hmm.
you bring it, it does provide the DR for your group, or that's the slot that you should have it in, essentially.
Hmm.
That's that is worth its weight in gold if it ever were to show up on the healing meters.
Yep.
And they might have been consistently looking at just the meters and not considering other aspects.
Well, I think a good sign of that for Dragonflight, especially, was like druids are getting Mark of the Wild, and DKs did not get a raid buff. And so I think maybe they are taking that into account. I don't know what they're considering the DK utility to be. Could be grip, could be AMZ, could be AMS, could be some other stuff. I don't
Being
really know. Maybe a
slow,
combination of all of them. Being
walking
slow.
slowly.
Well, having like knockback immunity and stuff like that is
Yeah.
useful. That was used in
Dire
artificial Zymox and stuff.
and
And
Zymox, yeah.
yeah, so like if classes do have that unique utility and stuff like that, whereas the class that maybe doesn't, like druids, which kind of just have roar and maybe innervate, um, which that also was in the universal class tree or whatever, so that even feral druids and stuff could get that now. Um, I think they are. I think they're at least aware of it, and they're probably making those sort of philosophical decisions of like what class utility should each class have, and if they don't have enough, can we just give them a new thing that
Yeah.
makes them have enough? So
Small
yeah,
small anecdote about DKs and like movement movement effects. Didn't we in Half Credit have a DK that learned more about Death's Advance, and he was saying like, why am I not getting gripped over to one of those lieutenant ads or whatever? And then after the night was over, after like literally 10 pulls of him not getting gripped over and us not killing the ad because of it, he was like, oh, I was popping Death's Advance or whatever it is that makes them not get
I
pulled.
do vaguely remember that, but I don't. I didn't remember it
Oh,
being Death's Advance, but I do remember that being an issue, and I just didn't know that that was what it was. That's funny.
yeah. So I mean, you know, I'm all for them finding the right way to approach it with evolving rate buffs, and I think it's kind of cool that druids get in the Mark of the Wild. Um, obviously, we'll need to have one. I I don't know if I like the concept that you need to have one of everything. I I'm
Well,
in between that.
like you were saying with the Joe Mythic Pluser in his plus tens getting invited because he's purple class. Like I think while that's nice for him, it is kind of a zero sum game where because Joe's getting invited, Mr. Boomkin isn't. And so it's like to some extent you kind of need everybody to have a spot where they're getting invited and playing somewhere, even if it's not necessarily like maybe the top key or whatever and top
Yeah.
race to world first comp. Like I think that's always kind of going to be out of reach to some extent of maybe every single class in every spec. Like I don't think that's a reasonable expectation necessarily. But for like the guilds that are CE or whatever, or the people that are wanting to push M plus to like, you know, 28s instead of maybe 32s or something like that. Like I think pretty much all classes and specs should be viable in those scenarios. And I definitely think balancing needs to be a lot more frequent, and you could dial things in and get things a lot closer if you were doing it a lot more frequently. For I also don't like that they either only ever like nerf the top or only ever buff the like three bottom specs when they should be doing like
Yeah.
both at once or or more than just three specs at a time. Um, you know, because a lot of times there's not just three specs at the bottom. There's like six, and only three of them get touched, and the three that are at spots sixth, fifth, and fourth from the bottom now just become the three that are at the very bottom, and it just cycles what the bottom three ones are, and like it's a very weird sort of thing. And when you have so many changes over time, if the first two or three rounds of buffs and nerfs go through, and then you're the ones that end up on the bottom. You're just stuck there for the end. You don't. There's no saving grace to come and save you at the end either, which
Yeah.
feels especially bad. I think
I'd
you
be
should have the end state be the like closest to balanced state. I think by the end.
yeah. I'd be incredibly interested in if they were to publish their tuning, and I know it's a lot, but address why they aren't affecting other specs. Because like you said, they sometimes from the bottom six they pull up three. It's like, well, why were they not brought up? You know, I think that's if we ever were to see that color, it would really help us understand a bit more
Well, like for
their thought
example,
process.
I think MM currently is the lowest simming spec for a single target of all DPS specs. And I looked today actually because I was curious because it's only 8% above Blood Decay for tanks
Mm.
as DPS for single target. And there's 17 DPS specs that are more than 8% above MM. So it's like there's 17 specs that have a wider gap to MM than MM does to Blood Decay. And so that to me just seems like radically wrong. And so I'm like, please buff MM Hunter. But the problem is they also made the tier set and the whole spec work around basically one button, which is aim shot, which does like 60% of my damage. And so if they want to buff my single target at all, it's like they kind of have to buff aim shot because that's what the majority of my damage is coming from. But they can't buff aim shot because aim shot is also my biggest AoE ability because it trick shots to everything. So they like backed themselves into a corner where they can't buff the spec at all, even though it's the weakest spec by far.
I
Like
mean, you can buff the
in single
damage
target
of aim shot and nerf trick shot.
trick shots.
Like,
That's what they should do. Yes, but
yeah.
previously they had to buff trick shots in one of the previous patches because MM was weak on AoE because we're still one of two specs that are AoE target capped also at 5 targets.
But
And
that's
so yeah, it's like all their past problems cause future problems as well, and they don't like go 2 steps back or 3 steps back if they have to like revert multiple things at once and start over like from the beginning of Shadowlands and change the spec to where it would function now. It's like they're only able to go 1 step back, and because they can't go 1 step back and that doesn't fix the problem, they're just stuck leaving it the way it is.
well, I
Like
mean,
rather than buffing aim shot and nerfing trick shots at once, they're just because they're only wanting to do one at a time, they don't do anything.
and hearing all of this, knowing that they're focusing on Dragonflight, I I get why it is that they just kind of say, like, you know what, patch is done in 2 months, let's ride it out.
I was
Like
gonna say
people
it
are
was
used to
funny
it.
because their actual solution to this problem was let's just buff BM hunters single target so that it's better.
Yeah,
And now BM is the spec you play on single target bosses,
I I,
which
I
I
do
mean
like that though.
that is a roundabout solution to the problem. But
I like
yeah,
that they make you on specs or classes that have the 3 DPS specs that are at least comparable, that they make you try to do something
have
else.
different identities for them. Yeah,
Yeah.
I do like that. My main issue with that is if you want BM to be like having a niche like that is that it should be I should be able to opt in sort of like Momentum Demon Hunter to it being a more complex spec that I get more rewarded for actually trying to play optimally and stuff like that. I don't like that it feels like the whole spec is limited at like this very baseline level and you just hit the ceiling super quickly. And especially as a player coming from MM that like I want to kind of challenge myself with like restricting my movement to where I have to stand still to cast stuff all the time or um whatever, like just having a more complex rotation and like balancing of resources that you're managing and like stuff like that. I would like to be able to opt into that to maybe get an extra 1 or 2% DPS out of BM to make it the best single target spec or something, rather than just being. I don't like hitting the ceiling of a spec and having the floor be so high.
Yeah.
That's
Do
that's my one feedback going into Dragonflight, I would say.
you think well, we talked about season 4, and the concept with our guild where we put out a survey at the end of each tier asking people if they want to change. Do you
Mhm.
think that you would ever want to try to drop Hunter for season 4 to experience a different class because of those types of things? Because like I know that a lot of the problems that you're mentioning are tied to Hunter specifically, but like you could experience season 4 through the lens of a different class entirely. But
Yeah, I think the problem is like with all the problems, I still think Hunter is the most fun class for me to play overall,
okay,
which is kind of it's a weird it's a weird spot to be in, I guess. If I was to change to anything, it would probably be Frost Mage. Um, Even though Havoc has been my main alt, I'm actually, I would say, definitely more comfortable playing the fights as ranged and things like that, and I would rather play the fights uh, as ranged continuing probably.
yeah.
But Havoc is also fun. But yeah,
I I
the thing with
remember.
Hunter also is I'm pretty willing to play at least the two ranged specs, and realistically, probably going to be able to play survival at some point in the future. Um, Whereas a lot of the other specs, like Mage, it's like I'm only really interested in playing Frost. Like Fire and Arcane are just kind of meh to me. I don't really like playing them. And same with Havoc
Interesting.
is like I would play Havoc, but I don't really want to tank. So it's like at least Hunter, I have some variety and options of playing the different styles of specs on different fights and being flexible like that. Whereas the other classes, I would be more locked probably in terms of like I could probably learn how to play Fire or Arcane if I had to, but I wouldn't really enjoy it as much as if I had to play MM or BM, I guess.
Yeah. It's funny, I remember when I learned that you had a Havoc Demon Hunter, the way I learned it was we were sitting in front of that one Porthia rare that you had to wait until it charged up.
Yep.
And
Consumption. Yep.
I just saw, like, I saw Riokaii right next to me. I was like, that's not how you spell Riokaii. He's not in the guild. What's happening? Who is this person? And it was you. But yeah,
Funny.
I hear you. It's weird because, like, as a healer, the only class that has multiple healing options is priest, and it's kind of cool
Right.
to be able to see people that like are able to flex to disc priest, which is significantly harder than holy priest. Like just the spec knowledge, like all the little
Yep.
aspects to it. Disc
It's
is
like
hard.
similar to BM to MM or something almost. Yeah.
Ye okay, Mr. Aimshot,
I'm.
but
I,
I
okay.
but no, but I
Yeah.
hear you about like the concept like that sometimes you just want to play one class to play one spec and that's okay at our level entirely, right?
Hmm.
Like nobody was expecting everybody to be multi-classes or anything like or multi-spec gods or something like that. Definitely can't from a healing perspective is all I'm trying to say. But um I don't know. Maybe for some closing thoughts, your thoughts on what's to come. How excited you are for Dragonflight for season 4, things that you want to see next, I guess.
I would say Dragonflight. I'm like 8 or 9 in it out of 10, maybe 8.5. Excited. Season 4, maybe slightly less, maybe like 7.5 to 8. Um, Main thing I'm excited about for season 4 is the gearing loot acquisition, item acquisition stuff, and I think I'll enjoy that a lot. And I'm actually not as excited for the affixes on the raids. Like, I feel like they'll either be annoying or they'll be unimpactful and not really change things that much, which I'm kind of okay with. I'm basically treating season 4 as the farm period of Sepulchre, kind of, and I just have a different change of scenery, and I get to have more variety in the bosses, kind of. It's almost like the bosses are the changing affix rather than the affixes themselves for the variety,
Okay.
kind of, if that makes sense.
Yeah.
Um, and then Dragonflight, I want to see the talents, especially, and play around with that. I'm very excited for Wrath Classic. I was just before we recorded this, I was recording videos going over the BIS lists for Hunter for Wrath Classic, putting those together um, to help people out doing that because I've played Wrath in the past with Morgie and Dare and Jor and a couple other people and things like that. So yeah,
Oh.
that also I will probably play for some amount of time in season 4. Probably I don't know even if I would get Dragonflight beta, if I would what I would how I would balance all three of them, but
Yeah,
um
that's true.
yeah.
Yeah, as an officer for the guild that you're in, I too would fear how you'd balance all that. But I
Luckily
would.
Wrath is like you kind of just have to play a lot in like the very first month and then it's like you can raid log from then on for the rest of the expansion, which is awesome. So
Yeah. And I would say for my enjoyment, at least among all the that you answered, I would say I'm extremely interested in Dragonflight. Like I would say 9.5 out of 10, just largely because there's a new healing class. That alone in itself ticks the box that makes me that much more interested.
That makes sense.
Because a large portion of my enjoyment is of the game is the people that I'm around, and I've found the right group to play with, obviously, and break. And so I'm I've ticked that box. You've given me a new healer. Man, this is crazy. The last point 0.5 that it wasn't given is just my fear of, you know, how good the game will be and how that much it will affect the players around me choosing to leave. Because I'm stuck in the rat race, man. I don't think I can quit. I will say that in season 4, a little less excited, but I am extremely excited to see Castle Nathria again. In the words
Yeah,
of
I
our
am excited to play Nathria with Break for sure.
I'm fearful because not everybody's seen it the way that we've seen it. Not everybody was playing at the caliber that we would have wanted around that time too. So it'll be very interesting to see like how long it takes us to progress those fights. What's our pain points? All these little things. I think that we can extrapolate what our thoughts would be just based off of how Jailer's going, but we'll approach that when we get to it. I know that season 4 will be great for Break in terms of recruitment, in general, just because it's important to us to maintain a roster. And over the course of the tier, we've only lost people really, haven't really gained as many. So I'm
I'm
excited to
definitely
see.
excited to have Jailer killed and be able to like kind of be
Relax.
in a different phase of yeah, exactly. Phase of the
There's
game
that
kind of.
anxiety. It's like you know we're gonna get CE, right? Like
Well,
it's gonna
yeah, but
happen, but
I was gonna
like,
say, but I don't want people to quit before then or like get burnt out before then. Like I kind of just want to like get over the finish line and then you can take your breath kind of thing. So
yep, I agree that that finish line in of itself, learning what's to come after that finish line too. It's something we've anticipated for a while, and I'm just excited to see it. But appreciate you chatting. Obviously, we'll figure out more our schedule as we go forward as to the times that work and how consistently we'll release, because we obviously covered a lot of topics today. I think that was about 2 hours or so, so it's a lot covered. But I'm sure we'll find other things to chat about.
I'm sure we will.
All right.